Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project, a platform for peer-to-peer conversations with the people that are helping to shape the carbon markets of tomorrow. Join me, Renee Velasquez, as I get to have conversations on topics ranging from ESG and finance over cocktails in the Lion City of Singapore. Cheers. My guests today are two titans of the carbon markets, Forrister, President and CEO at the International Emissions Trading Association, and Allister Furey, CEO at Silvera. I was privileged enough to sit down with Dirk and Al over cocktails during their recent visit to Singapore. Join us as we get to chat about the importance of carbon pricing, technology, and the role of markets in helping to achieve a net zero future. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. Gentlemen, welcome to Singapore and welcome to 28 Hong Kong Street. It's a pleasure to see you.
Well, cheers. Good to see you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. So, thanks for joining me. Really excited about speaking with both of you guys. You're effectively shaping, Dirk, I told you this, right? You're the elder statesman of our industry, right? And you've ushered in, ultimately, different eras, effectively, of carbon markets. We're not a nascent market, it's an adolescent market. It's like the analogy that I use. But you've seen this kind of transformation throughout your journey. I want to ask you questions about that. And what I asked you both here for, right, Allister, is you guys share this transformation kind of streak right now in terms of helping to shape the markets for the future, ultimately via technology and ultimately through kind of navigating this kind of policy framework. So that's really the theme I hope to unpack with you guys today. Can I get your opinions ultimately, because we're in a really interesting time also in carbon markets, given the broader kind of macro environment context around rates and all the stuff we're familiar with. Liquidity has essentially decreased. It's not ground to a halt, but essentially it's come off the highs and the foaminess and the froth that we had in 21. But we're at this interesting juncture, I feel, right, with the advent of an implementation of the Paris Agreement. How do you guys see this market now in this kind of transformative moment? Dirk?
Well, I see it as a market that is going through some growing pains.
Yeah.
And that's not just in the voluntary carbon market. Voluntary markets are, tiny compared to the compliance world.
Compliance, yeah.
But in the compliance world, we're at a point of, like in the EU, pricing is skyrocketed compared to what we were all expecting because of the war in the Ukraine.
Yep.
And that really, the tensions around that enabled EU policymakers to step up their ambition and both to deepen the targets and to add another ETS. Other jurisdictions are going through the same thing. And what it's about, I think, is like net zero sinking in.
Very much
right?
So.
It's a difficult economic environment. It's a difficult geopolitical environment. And right at a time when we need markets to be enabled to work together, a lot of big countries are turning inward, and it's a lot more tense because of that. And the pressure on voluntary markets, I think, is insignificant in comparison to that. Although I think the potential on voluntary markets is massive, mainly because corporates are beginning to take that transition more seriously than some government, like the United States, right? Don't have political agreement on where we ought to go. We've got a Democratic plan that's large dose of subsidy. But guess what? That's all voluntary. You don't have to take the subsidy, but many companies are. But I think it's going to start a wave of transition that you can't stop. But also, to get to net zero, you've got to cooperate with somebody else. And that's a market structure. So that's what I think this is like kind of a pivotal moment, right? We're going through these upgrades. There's an EU ETS upgrade. There's a California upgrade. There's an Australia upgrade. New markets coming online and getting their own sea legs. So it's a pretty vibrant time and really exciting if you care about getting to net zero.
Completely.
And if you don't care about getting to net zero, then you throw...
Well, you're going to miss out on the tidal wave.
Yeah, and you throw sand in the gears on markets or nature-based solutions or CCS, any of those things that are actually the breakthroughs that you need. You throw sand in the gears. But if you're serious about getting to net zero, you have to have all of those things.
Completely. And I love that sense of optimism, And you're absolutely correct. Because a lot of the times we effectively focus in on our little patch, right? And so as market sentiments wane or you enter this bull or bearish kind of cycles, we tend to kind of just locked in, right? But we sometimes need that perspective. Effectively, I've been through a number of these cycles already. So this is not as bad as folks think, right? And there is so much optimism. I was at a McKinsey event last night, and they really talked about kind of the inevitability of net zero transition, and ultimately that the thematics are so comprehensive and just compelling that ultimately this is a tectonic kind of shift for capital allocation, but ultimately transforming industries at large, right? So curious to get your take on that, Allister, right? In terms of the broader kind of thematics, but then I'd love to dive in terms of what, how you're seeing the evolution around the space that you're ushering in, kind of technology and how that's valued.
Yeah, I would definitely bring it up to kind of my simplistic level.
Yeah, sure. So I bet it's not simplistic.
Well, I mean, people talk about carbon market, and then it's easy to forget the context. So, like, the context is climate change is the context, right?
Yeah.
So the whole origin of carbon markets is like whether you're a country or you're a private sector entity like a company, all those entities are going to have to reduce their emissions and start to pull down carbon. Right? So the whole idea of a market then would be like, say I'm some Swiss cement company or I'm Switzerland.
Yep.
Like, I'm going to work through the decarbonisation steps that I can, and they tend to get more expensive if you start to squeeze them out. So you've got your MAC curve, and also, and I can't remember who I was relating this to. I was with this is just an anecdote that kind of makes it like a bit more real. With one of the top 3 tech companies in the world, and talking to someone in their finance team. So I love the finance team or engineers because they're just very real.
Yeah,
and they were basically saying. They're still working through the free part of the MAC curve.
Yeah,
as in
low-hanging fruit.
It's the low-hanging fruit. But you're like, wow, this is literally one of the most valuable companies, most profitable companies in the world.
Who are just leaving money on the table, essentially, through inefficiency.
They're still having basically free, they get a return on the investment for the lowering their carbon intensity.
Yeah.
And they're not even starting to spend money yet. And it was kind of like, well, I just couldn't believe it, honestly. And she's like, it's just a capacity thing. We just don't have the internal capacity to do it at the speed. So it's not a money thing, it's a capacity thing.
Completely. But I actually challenged that. I was at a conference earlier in the week. It was an oil and gas conference. And that same kind of problem was represented by just an industry veteran, like, in terms of oil and gas. And he just said, essentially, there was never an incentive. The price of carbon was not sufficiently high for us essentially to take everything below that line, right? And as the price starts to climb, now it makes a material impact. Where the alternative is essentially pay the tax, pay the allowance, pay the offset costs, right? Or invest into the CapEx kind of pieces to go up that hierarchy. But you need the incentive. And if carbon price stays at 0 or relatively close to, you don't do that.
I was just going to say that incentive piece that you bring up that's fundamentally what the market is about, right? Like when you really step back and look at the policy alternatives that we usually use in environmental law, right? It's like command and control. Tell me exactly what to do. On this one, there's so many point sources of carbon emissions. That ain't going to work. So then you start thinking about, well, let's move upstream. Let's see if we can tax it. Okay, the political will for getting the tax at the right level so that you can actually drive the reductions that are needed and getting it right.
And the international then arbitrage.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
And do you get it right? Like, or do you have to adjust that tax up or down? What if you get it wrong on the high side? And you kill
loads of business.
And what if you get it too low? Then you're suspicious because all you really wanted was the money. You don't really want to reduce emissions. You want to keep collecting money, so people are suspicious about that. That's really why cap and trade emerged, I think, is you need a cap. And it needs to decline to net zero. And it needs to cut across many sectors. And there's not another model to do that kind of at a high level that enables business to kind of make the adjustment and those conversations to happen, really.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
And then you now at the cusp point, this kind of transition, talking about, you have the voluntary carbon market, you have the compliance markets, which are kind of their little walled gardens at the moment, or until the CBAM that's been like kind of cut off totally from the world.
But that's going to have flow-on effects.
It will do, yeah. And so the CBAM and Article 6 and the cross-border transactions between governments in our view, you can see actually, well, we expected them to drive convergence, but which is basically like using voluntary credit in more compliance context than you currently can. And because you kind of have to do that because the voluntary credits are exist in geographies, and those geographies are going to be selling ITMOs to other geographies. So it's kind of forcing that reconciliation. So you're going to see voluntary carbon markets appear in jurisdictions where they may be used in a compliance setting.
We already see precedents for that. Colombia, Singapore,
exactly,
as perfect examples.
Exactly, and there's more in discussion and planning for sure, which is a really positive thing.
Which is great.
Yeah.
I talked to Dan Ventinoli in a previous episode, and essentially what we hit upon was exactly that theme. Essentially, voluntary markets effectively have filled in the vacuum, the gaps where there's lack of policy direction, right? But ultimately, what it has been is the incubator for innovation, ultimately, and so registry infrastructures, right? The governance frameworks around certification for those outcomes, et cetera, now can be leveraged to create those markets of the future, which is essentially what you're describing.
Yeah, I think that aspect of filling in the gaps it's an important one because I think there are jurisdictions that are going to face real difficulty in getting the caps in place.
Yeah.
But I do think that where they started, when you go back on all of this to the beginnings, it was all voluntary. You know, in the EU, like that grew out of some voluntary experiments and simulations that Euroelectric and I think the IEA did back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But prior to that, it was like a few voluntary trades in Australia, in Canada, in the US, and companies were just trying to sort of do proof of concept, so show that you could do this, right?
Yeah.
And when you see where all of that has come to date, like the level of sophistication in the current methodologies, even before the upgrades are going through.
Oh no, we're building on strong foundations.
Years beyond where it started.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So you kind of be building on iterative kind of foundation.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect kind of analogy to what we see sort of like within compliance systems that are, let's say, where they have fungibility of traditionally voluntary instruments. I'm thinking of Corsia as a perfect example. You talked about this kind of like runway kind of approach, ultimately from the pilot phase being purely voluntary. Phase one is also voluntary at the level of countries opting into the system, and then you hit into a compliance market in 2027 and onwards, right? So it's essentially learn by doing. Building the capacity was the thematic, really, that IATA was trying to advocate, and ICAO ultimately ended up doing. So I guess, within that, like we're talking about ultimately this intersection, and you talked about ITMOs and kind of how these markets kind of evolve. How do you see that happening in real time? Maybe I'll ask you this question, Dirk, because from an infrastructure perspective, one of the core tenets is ultimately to ensure against double counting and double issuance piece. So AIDA has been instrumental along with the World Bank to ultimately set up the Climate Action Data Trust, the CAD Trust. That's an infrastructure piece upon which the markets can be built. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I mean, sure. I mean, it came out of a lot of consultations about what do we need to build more confidence to spur the growth. And part of this is around bringing together all of the information that's in various registries in one place so that you can do your diligence checks easier. And you can
no longer silos.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also for those to gradually draw in national registries, because we also expect there'll be country registries for that.
And we're seeing that happen right now.
And so seeing all of that to have high integrity from the beginning, for it to have all the right, everybody's measuring the right things. There are like 40 fields that they would measure and report on. It also will make their ability, as countries, their ability to report to the UN easier because they'll have this kind of the automaticity that comes.
For the stock take.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that was the notion, but it's also because in the business community, people wanted to know how do I get a credit from A to B?
Yeah.
And we've been through this before. We did this in the Kyoto era, right? I remember we used to go to those of us that were funding projects back then and go to the executive board meetings and pound on them about when is the registry architecture going to be up and running so you can issue. And that wasn't good enough. Then they had to do the ITL that connected it to national registries. Yeah. Well, that was an IT job that took a long time.
And it's still imperfect today.
Yeah.
Some of those national transfers can take sometimes 48 hours to settle. So it's T+2. It's really inefficient.
And it's that's just to get it from one to another. And then in that world, it was very difficult to get it from one country to another until the EU architecture came together. So we still want to do that again. We wanted to get, do our part to, since everything's going digital, and most of this will land on blockchain, I think.
I was going to say,
provide those specs.
This decentralized ledger essentially provides that solution, right? It was always a solution looking for a problem, like a hammer looking for a nail, and now it seems to have kind of found that perfect kind of
I think it can be of great service in carbon markets, and part of it is related to the kind of information it can bring really quickly, but also the ability to, because of that decentralized nature, it's a lot more difficult to hack, right?
Yeah.
So we learned this problem, again, in Europe about, at the beginning of the EU ETS, there were 28 different registries in member states that then had to have these connections to each other. And that was, and that was as good, that system was as good as the weakest link. So it did get breached in one country. There were thefts. They got moved to another country. They got moved to a third country. They got sold on an exchange, created a cloud over the whole market. But boy, did we learn a lesson. Like the EU then consolidated them and made it much more bulletproof, right? So I think we've anticipated those problems, right? And wanting to get to a place, right? And interestingly on that one, Renee, the common cause that governments, private sector, and the World Bank and other development banks had in trying to launch this thing, I haven't seen anything quite like that. I don't know.
It's gone really, really quickly, and it's been very detailed, but also focused. In terms of
and just big congratulations to the government of Singapore for seeing that and being willing to support it. And the governing council of it is a mix of government reps and private reps that will help to oversee this, curate it. And it isn't the web that connects it all. It's just the data specs that will help that emerge, right? Yeah, because it's private service providers. I think they'll actually
they'll
provide
end up
that.
doing that. Yeah, no doubt. Okay, cool. So maybe we're in kind of really esoteric kind of subject matter, right?
Are we?
We're diving really into it, but it's fine. But okay, so we're talking about essentially infrastructure that's necessary to be built, to enable the next kind of generation of the markets to evolve.
Right.
So Vera, in terms of the focus of what you guys are doing, and ultimately on the rating side, essentially, I'm curious to see your kind of take around the wealth of that data that would reside at both national and, let's say, project levels. Your focus currently, correct me if I'm wrong here, but on a project level kind of approach.
Yeah.
But you're talking also to governments around jurisdictional kind of baselines, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, the benefits essentially of a meta registry is one, and then also kind of getting your input around how your market around creating value, ultimately via rating evolves.
Yeah, I think that the kind of meta registry and the infrastructure around transfer of ownership, etc., and like a central record is valuable. So that's the kind of how stuff. So we're a little bit more on the kind of what. So what are the properties of those different instruments being traded over time? And I think we kind of like, this comes back to the beginning of the company. You just got to call a spade a spade. Like, these are all valid instruments under the methodologies by which they've been generated.
Sure.
But if you look under the hood, they do have different properties, right?
Yeah.
So to pretend, and maybe you'll come to more of a commodity market at some point. But
there's differentiation.
Yeah, like you were saying earlier, there's a million different levers you've got to pull all at the same time in lots of different jurisdictions, which may have different standards and way of thinking about things. Just like one thing people might not appreciate is just the definition of forest is different in different jurisdictions.
Completely.
So like, there's no such thing as forests. The way that it would be described in Mozambique is different to how it's described in Peru, for example, in terms of what the spec is. So those differences are going to be embedded within the underlying instrument, effectively. So this is what we try and do. Is I think there's absolute common properties. So you might say there's a few dozen that apply across all instruments, and then there are a bunch of more specific properties that would apply for different types of instruments. So, for example, for a forest carbon credit, we might extract maybe definitely several hundred parameters, somewhere between 500 and 800 parameters that we'd would be like the fingerprint of the project that will then go on to reconstruct the modelling and all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
But those and they would be highly conserved across that project type. But if you're then looking at like maybe, you know, early coal retirement, this is kind of a topical thing, it's going to have a completely different set of properties.
Completely.
So, but then you're going to, you know, Indonesian coal retirement of a power station that has just been commissioned last year, like realistically, isn't the same as retiring a coal power station in, say, Colombia that's been operating for 25 years. It's near the end of life, and it's a completely different financing environment, and you know, cost of capital, all these kind of things. So like there'll be guardrails to make sure that those things are have been created with some commonality, so that you can centralize those things in one place. But the actors, whether it's the government level or the private sector level, are probably, especially as the level of the spend and therefore the kind of risk management aspect becomes more core, they want to look under the hood and maybe have more of a portfolio approach, maybe quantify their risks, track their risks, and also think about the effectiveness of the credit. So this is kind of the kind of what end of the spectrum where we sit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you know, obviously trying not to kind of introduce my bias, but what you mentioned around ultimately this commoditization, right? I think that there's this knee-jerk kind of, or this willingness, I guess, or hope that it can be really simplified and you just have one commodity, one price for carbon. But that's not possible. And it's not the case across other commodity classes. In fact, and the reality is any asset class, whether it's any securities, whether it's bonds or if it's on the equity side, but just on the commodity side, you get differentials. You get basically basis spreads emerging. Exactly. You might have a benchmark, but things get traded relative to that benchmark. And so what we've seen, certainly on the exchange side, is as we brought in contracts to standardize, essentially, here's a common basket, essentially. Once that gets traded on the spot, and ultimately then it begets a futures contract, now you have liquidity and essentially this bridge between financial markets. But the behavior of the market participants therein essentially now look for value. Right? And so ratings are a key differentiator, essentially. The higher the rating, the correlation is to a higher price premium being paid. Conversely, discounts on lower rated projects. So that's one of many different variables.
Yeah,
right?
they facilitate that basic market function of trying to reflect the underlying attributes of the instrument, right? Yeah, for sure.
And that's similar to bonds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Now, kind of coming back, I'd love to understand kind of your personal journeys so far. Al, maybe can I start with you? Before we started, essentially you were talking about, you know, having lived here in Singapore, and I'd love to unpack your kind of journey in terms of, you know, career journey, in terms of how you've come to being an entrepreneur and effectively, you know, creating a startup that now is having significant impact in terms of helping to shape the narrative and the evolution of the market today at Silvera.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to give the non-circuitous version of it, but
let's go deep.
I'm kind of like a sort of a bit ADHD, and I'm kind of like interested in lots of things. So I'm more like a systems person. Originally I'm a biologist.
Okay.
So I studied.
We share that in common. I'm a biochemist by training.
There you go. So I nearly did a biochemistry. This is a perfect articulation. I actually had an offer to go study biochemistry, and then I bailed on it, and I went to do neuroscience instead, which is it's like a systems biology thing. So, but molecular and then the system level. And then I ended up there going more level of abstraction and doing neural networks and the sort of what wasn't called machine learning then, but it was like AI, you know. And then I didn't really know what to do because basically I'm not a very good employee. So I started a company which was basically a clothing label. But it's the only thing you could do with no money basically at that time, which is the early 2000s. And I'm not into fashion at all. I saw this guy, I used to live here 6 years ago, and he literally said, I think you're wearing the same clothes as the last time I saw you, which I think is probably true. So I'm not the right person to start a fashion company. And then
what happened to that fashion?
Well, we all we all had good fun doing the thing, but none of us was into fashion. You know, it's a terrible business in general, and because margins are thin, and
very razor thin margins.
Exactly. So
inventory, you pick the wrong.
It's
exposure.
It's brutal. It's a brutal business, but a good learning environment.
Great learning environment.
Then
we share that in common as well. I started my career in fashion.
I had no idea.
Didn't know that either.
Well, I mean, you look like you might be into fashion. You've got the purple suit, and I do not. And then so I was like, I was into sustainability, but I didn't really know how to get in there. And so I'd been writing like little letters to Bill Clinton on his energy policy at a time where you'd get a little card back written, not by him, but like it would be a physical thing you get in the post.
By me. No, I'm kidding.
But yeah, they would, and so I've always been into that. And then so I was like, I'll go use my skill, which is the sort of machine learning stuff, and then I'll do something useful. So I was like, I'll build control systems using this technology to improve the performance of wind energy systems, trying to drive the cost down. So I did that, and we spun that PhD work out into a company. Shell funded it, E.ON funded it. Nobody in the venture community wanted to touch clean tech. This was 2010 by the time I finished that. And ran that company for a few years, sold it, and had to get a job because I needed some money, and I was having kids and I'd got married and stuff. So then I helped basically
your paycheck years.
Yeah, a few paycheck years, which were really good learning because I was here helping literally dozens of companies start up very early using technology. And lots of them went into med tech, clean tech. You know, some were more conventional startups, and then I'd had my second child, and I was like, okay, that's done, right? I'm going to go back to sustainability. And then the whole energy thing was, it was, I don't know, honestly, it was kind of upsetting because you're like, I'd been kind of in a different world, and you're coming back and you're like, the world is so far off track. And it's, it was obvious 20 years ago what needed to happen. And like, despite it being completely obvious, it's not happened on time. The whole thing about net zero is, it's like a plan D. We shouldn't be clawing back tens of billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's like the most inefficient thing. Like we have to do it. We have to do it because now it's too late to just manage the climate impacts through decarbonisation. But it was not the sensible thing to do. It's going to be more expensive to do that. So then it's like, okay, well, if now that's the plan. There's no plan E, right? There's no next plan. That's the only plan there is now. So the thinking initially was, can you use some of the lessons from the renewable energy sector, because they have been very successful in driving costs. Wind and solar, it's the big success story, right? So CapEx, OpEx, cost of capital, and the productivity asset, those things are like, religious goals in renewable energy. And so we're like, cool, what can we do to make absolutely incredible, completely bulletproof removal of carbon from the atmosphere at gigaton step as fast as possible? The speed has to be nature-based.
Yep.
The cost has to be nature-based. So then we were like, okay, you're using the AI, you're looking at the climate science, you're looking at the AI, and you're basically saying, where are the areas in the world that have that basically can optimize on those attributes? And you don't want to compete with human food production. So the kind of thinking was, go where there's no food production and no people, that's basically not now suitable for vegetation or has not been for maybe thousands of years, but because of climate change is going to be subject to a lot more rain, or maybe already is being subject to a lot more rain. And those areas will regreen naturally, and that's part of the natural homeostatic system of the planet. You're going to get areas go dry that were now green, and some areas are good. But because there's no vegetation there to let the rain percolate in, and there's not a lot of soil, there's not a lot of seed bank, it'll take 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. So we're like,
you need an impetus in terms of
reforestation. Exactly. So like the whole thinking was, which are the areas that at scale you can expend the least money and effort and have the highest like restoration potential driven by your intervention into that system. So you take a 2,000-year regreening, you compress it into 50 to 100 years, and you can then do it at like a subcontinental scale. So we were then like, oh wow, there's places in the world this is totally possible, and we were like, great, we're going to go get this funded. Go to my friends who'd taken sensible careers in banks and stuff. The answer is like, you'll never get this funded off the basis of the carbon revenues, because you'll never get the fair price. Well, basically the carbon market is dysfunctional. It can't price the fact that you have like a 2,000-year permanent reforestation credit. Just like that concept of that doesn't exist. We need like $15, $20 well, $15 break even, 20 to get an ROI on it, which now would be considered good for ARR credit. But at that time, trying to get an offtake that would support, 50 million of capex minimum to get the thing kicked off, impossible, right? So we're like, well, this isn't actually about our project and our technology.
It's a market failure.
It's a market failure. And we're like, oh my word. Net zero now is the only plan we have. The net requires billions of tons of carbon, and nobody could finance the billions of tons. So this is like even worse. So we're like, so we ended trying to do. We started trying to do Terraform. We ended up building a ratings agency, and that's basically how it got so very. We're like, well, it's a fundamental limiting factor to the deployment of capital. So we'll go and that'll be the thing we can do that's useful for the world. Is try and unlock the capital by establishing the market function. So that's basically the
logic. But I love that systems architecture and that thinking, because ultimately you see these inefficiencies, try to create solutions for it, and then it's adapting to ultimately fill a market need.
Yeah, and it does. When we started, people thought we were completely insane, I have to say, and they were like, "What are you talking about?" And we had a very small number of interactions that made us believe it. One was the chief sustainability officer of a listed UK business who, without giving too much details away, because you might be able to infer, he was just like the most depressed person you've ever met, because he was an environmental scientist, and he knew there was issues with the integrity of some of the credits, especially on the cheap end, the XCDM renewables credits. And they used to have quite an expensive portfolio, and they claimed carbon neutrality off it. And basically, as the margin of the business was struggling for the cyclical reasons, the CFO was like,
invest in the lowest cost.
Just get the lowest cost. And so their strategy was 99.5% of the credits were like the minimum cost hydro credits or whatever you get, and like 0.5% of like a veneer of some local landscape restoration or something. And he was like, give me the leverage to demand the high budget for my CFO, and we can actually deliver good environmental outcomes. And that was like, and that was really formative, because at the beginning we're like, okay, there's some people that buy this, and then we met one of the, I probably shouldn't name it on this, but one of the top 3 management consultancies, and they were like, yeah, we also think that this kind of theory of change thing, you just need the data as part of the infrastructure, and they were like, cool, come and have a look at our credits, and we were kind of off and running at that point.
Yeah,
but there was nearly a year where people just mostly thought we were crazy. So yeah, that was a difficult time.
Interesting. I remember the time when you guys called me. Hopefully, I was one of the receptive ones.
You were one of the receptive ones, yes.
I remember saying, where have you guys been all my life, when they finished the pitch. And then in quick succession, obviously, there's this kind of Cambrian explosion of innovation around ratings, which is fantastic, right? Now we've got other firms in that space as well, who are doing great work. Yeah. So Dirk, can I turn to you? Because obviously I've known you for ages, and we've had some amazing experiences, I think in like maybe 4, maybe 5 continents we've traveled to over the years. Yeah. And obviously, I've had the privilege of getting to know you and understanding your journey, but I think the audience would really appreciate. Can you give us, like Al just gave us, kind of a synopsis around your journey, how you found yourself here? And if I can, if you'll allow me the kind of latitude, Al, you touched on kind of success stories. You talked about renewables and how that's a market success story, right? Ultimately, carbon markets played a large part in effectively helping to channel, basically, finance, ultimately help stand up those markets. And over time, the machinations of industry, in particular in China, ultimately helped to scale the deployment of solar in particular, but wind as well. And then ultimately, the prices have come down significantly. Look at Swanson's law of photovoltaics, like $800 a megawatt hour back in the mid 2000s to now it's the lowest cost energy source in the world. So that's a success story. I think another success story, we were talking about that earlier on when you came in, was essentially the acid rain program, right? And how that is also a significant policy win, and to a success story that is a corollary for carbon markets more broadly. Can I take you back to that time?
Sure. So I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm basically a failed singer-songwriter.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
And then
we should get a guitar.
Then I went to, I decided to go to law school. And coming out of law school, decided I really was more interested in policy and politics than actually the practice of law. So ended up getting a job on Capitol Hill for a congressman that was on the committee that was working on acid rain. I didn't have that job. That was another guy who who actually was passionate about the environmental stuff. I was just like, just more interested in telecom and, you know, the artsy side of things, tying back to the recording industry and movies. And so I did that set of policy things. And then he decided to go off to law school. So they asked me to babysit the acid rain issue for a little while they recruited someone. And then I found out I kind of liked it. I had been doing energy, so it was a lot of the same energy players. And the honest truth is, I think my boss was really gifted on it. He was a Harvard lawyer, had been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford in economics, so he really got this. And on the trading policy part of it, that's what we specialize in, like keeping the cap pure and making sure that the trading architecture was nimble, all those kinds of things. And so fast forward a couple of years as it's that legislation is almost nearing the finish. And I had this naive experience of, I wasn't part of the 20 years of fights on acid rain in the streets before that, right? I came in at the end and we got it done in 2 years, and I thought, well
everything's going to be like this easy.
Yeah. So he asked me to go, you know, phone up Environmental Defense Fund and a couple of others, and let's figure out is there a way to apply this same tool to climate. And so we wrote a carbon trading bill in like 1989, 1990, introduced it as a discussion piece, got a lot of feedback. We introduced it again the next Congress, and with the plan of tacking it onto an energy bill. This is like, we thought we had back then this environmental trading stuff was very bipartisan. Brought Republicans and Democrats together. So we had Republican co-sponsors on the legislation we were working on. And we failed to get it, but we did add a title to this energy bill in 1992 that essentially created a voluntary carbon credit registry with the Energy Information Administration. And that was used for the next 15 years by U.S. energy companies. This was before there was a Vera registry or a ACR registry or any of that. And companies would report their data on emissions reductions they made on their own system, or if they bought internationally in forestry projects. And there was experimentation back then. So that got me noticed by the Clinton people when they came in. And I got an offer.
That's why you signed his Clinton letter.
I was going to say, I got moved to or I got offered a job to work for the Energy Secretary, Hazel O'Leary, in the first term of Clinton. Yes, and I was her climate advisor. I didn't sign postcards, but I really enjoyed working for her, and she put me on the negotiating teams for COP1. So the lead up to COP1, then the Kyoto Protocol. But by the time Kyoto came along, I got an offer to go to the White House and chair an interagency task force to support the negotiations. And so I did that for a couple of years. But all of this was because of acid rain. And back in that period, on the acid rain trading stuff, my job was basically duking it out with other congressional offices on allocations, right? Which is, you know, it was free allocations that were going to decline. And so, you know, it's like a totally new kind of a policy instrument. But I found it a lot of fun. I did somewhere in that era have an option to go back and be the lobbyist for the recording industry. The woman called me from the Grammys to offer me the job, and I was like, oh, but I like this climate stuff. I think it might be important. But I could go home more to Nashville if I worked for her, and it was really a tough call. But anyway, then going from there,
sliding doors.
Right, and I leaving the Clinton administration, decided to stay in the field. I worked for Environmental Defense Fund for a while. Then I got poached by NatSource, which was a carbon credit boutique. You know, wanted to be an asset management company in New York City, kind of in that first real wave, right? They moved me to London at a really valuable time because the whole market was starting to take shape. Really, center of the universe was London there for a while. And then I rode that as long as I could. But frankly, when Obama couldn't get legislation done, the owners and that company sort of said, this feels like EU is backing away from carbon credits. Japan had Fukushima, they were backing away. Those were our core markets. And the owners decided maybe we should pull back our chips for a while, put it into something else, and consider our options later. That's when I kind of moved into the role at AIDA. So, I've worked on this issue like from the political side and government, from the sort of an NGO side at EDF, from the business side at NatSource, and now in the association job, where I think our job is to relate with all of the above. So it's kind of a good fit in building on all of this. But when I think back, Renee, I don't know what it was like for you, Allister, but like in my schooling, we didn't know about. We knew about acid rain, but there was like there was no Earth in the Balance from Al Gore yet. There was no scientific alarms going off that we heard in the science.
I just got the beginning of that.
Yeah.
So like the Al Gore and Convenient Truth kind of timeline, right?
When I was at school, it was before that. I'm aging myself here.
Yeah. Well, I remember when Al was working on the book, because Tennessee, right? I was working for a congressman. He was in the Senate. My boss wanted his seat. He was happy for him to become vice president. He tried and didn't get it. But I remember during the acid rain deliberations dealing with Al's staff, who were, we were dealing with all Tennessee issues as well. And it's like, where is the senator in all of this? Well, he's writing a book. He's like really, really focused on global warming. I was like, global warming? Come on, really? We have a problem right now. And Al was writing this masterpiece, right? And that, of course, is there to help out when the fights between, or the conference, we call it, not fights, but House and Senate duke it out on the final compromise. He was involved then, but it was fascinating that then, like a few years later, I'm kind of working for him at the White House. But he's still a titan on this issue.
Very much so. It's really incredible kind of journey. But you basically described it essentially. Ultimately, life throws these kind of opportunities, and ultimately we choose the direction that we want to go to.
And what's driving us. And I went from like being in the Oval Office doing briefings before, in that Kyoto period. Not a lot, but back then it doesn't bubble up to Oval Office very often. But I was there, and then like, I don't know, 3 years later, 4 years later, I remember thinking that I was like, did I really make a good career choice when I'm in South Korea in some, I won't say what town it was, looking at their landfill and like stomping around saying, yeah, this is really good. I see some flares that aren't really working. It's like, kind of light years apart, right? About what a beautiful landfill, and wanting to, cozy up to these people to try to get the methane capture opportunity there. Yeah.
Low hanging fruit.
Yeah, low hanging fruit.
Yeah. So then question. So now looking back, so you asked yourself that question when, like in the mid-90s or something, right at that time. But now looking back, are you happy about the impact that you've had and the kind of legacy that you're leaving?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's right now. I almost feel like in the world of climate change, I've said this to newcomers into the market, like, be careful, we eat our young. It's like for some reason in the climate space, you have to have an enemy. In order, I think I say that the NGO side, I think, wants to create an enemy on a problem where we actually need collective action.
We need collective action.
We all need to be together.
Yeah.
But that challenge doesn't go away. And it feels like each industry segment gets a turn to sit in the penalty box, right? So when I started on this issue, everybody hated the utilities. They're like the biggest target, right? Because they're big, dirty, and you can campaign around them, and then
the hot seat goes.
And then they start declining their emissions. There are things they can do, and then whose turn is it? Well, the financial crisis happened.
Yes, the
banks. They're horrible. The finance, anything associated with market, right? Cap and trade gets turned into demonized as cap and tax from the far right and the far left, right? And now it's markets, involuntary markets that are attracting the scrutiny. And I roll my eyes about it sometime and think, don't you realize these are the change agents and these companies, these are the people, their job's on the line. If they can't find good, high quality, they're working it. And like your guys, like they want to do the right thing. They're trained to do it. And yet if you attack them it becomes a career-limiting opportunity, as one of my colleagues used to call it. It's not. I used to also feel like one of the important things in our market was looking for where do people go next? When they get assigned this opportunity, what's the next thing they do? Is it like a step up inside their company? Do they get, and there for a while in the big energy companies, especially, the guy that was on point on climate change, he got sent out to work on a secret project somewhere.
Siberia.
It's like,
That's interesting. But I mean, from the outside looking in, certainly within AIDA, I think it's like the finishing school. Like in terms of the talent pool that you have essentially mentored, who now have seeded into large organizations and essentially helping to drive the policy direction and kind of the next generation of markets. They're everywhere. Right? That's a legacy.
Absolutely.
Right there,
and some of
the opportunities were there, right? They just made them.
There's some of that is AIDA would get a little bit of credit for that, but I really believe it is the market.
Well, the market, it's about efficiency, but it also, people need a leg up, right? And they need to be mentored and they need to kind of be given an opportunity, and the optimism is key.
I was thinking about those, at times like the CDM era and the collapse of that when Europe lost confidence in it, and when the U.S., I think the vision was the U.S. is going to come in and they're going to force better changes in the next wave. And the U.S. demand that didn't really materialize, like the law didn't pass.
Sure.
Right? But I think as that was
same
happening,
parallels in Australia.
Yeah. And when I would go around, go into China, and you'd find all of this professional class that had been built up of young people that were doing PDDs or doing working for verification companies, and they're all coming up with their resumes, looking for something to do. We created this whole army. But then we decided to
kind of
abandon, right?
But they then have caused second order impacts,
100%,
exactly. Which is really fascinating, right? It's like this. The army was abandoned, to kind of use your analogy, but ultimately they went and set up their own systems, and now we're reaping the rewards from
coming back. That's
100%.
right.
And with the number of people that we meet that we did X and we did Y in this wave, and they're kind of ready for it, and they were never doing it for the money. They were always doing it
for the impact, and for the kind of the feeling of leaving something of merit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we just need that to be more durable now and scale. Right? So it's amazing to have these experienced people come back and share that
I think so.
their experiences and then want to contribute. You're definitely seeing it en masse.
I completely agree, and I think that this inevitability, coming back to that piece, right, around sort of net zero and ultimately markets helping to drive that. You have a famous kind of line, I like to say famous, but you said to me personally, and I think you've said this in multiple fora, that ultimately if you're against markets on the carbon market side, then you're against the Paris Agreement. So a lot of the times people are ultimately for the Paris Agreement in terms of, the target is ultimately what you said before around, hey, we have a finite budget and the actual issue at hand is effectively reducing emissions to get us to net zero in a time frame, right? Yeah. But you can't do that if you don't have the markets piece, right? So it's kind of bipolar kind of voice, and ultimately we've got these straw man arguments that create these perverse outcomes.
It's probably the biggest engine of change in the agreement.
It is.
Right? I would say, in terms of mobilizing private sector capital, it is, we need the caps. We do need the NDCs to spread and to get tougher and tougher in order to create the signal that you do have to change. But in order to actually get the money to the places where, I love your example about the ultimate needs of areas that are degraded to come back to help suck carbon out of the air. That's absolutely right. But to get the money to go to those places, you have to have connective tissue. And that's what the market thing does. And it also creates that incentive that we talked about at the beginning, right? Where it's that's one of my real frustrations in this is having worked in the environmental community a little bit. And it seems like there's always a fear that the people in the markets are just trying to make money.
But
they're trying to make money.
They're trying to allocate finance efficiently to where it can make an impact at the lowest cost. It's a complex system.
And you use
greed certainly, but you got to harness that greed to ultimately impact and create the outcomes that are necessary. It happens in other financial markets. Why should this be different?
100%. And you use the word incentive. And when I was explaining what we did to a friend of mine, he's like, it's complicated. You're just letting people get paid to do the right thing. And it's like, we are letting people get paid to do the right thing. You know, if you're expecting some
altruism to drive this, it's not going to scale.
Yeah, because things need to be paid for. You need to pay to protect the forest. You need to pay to change energy systems. You need to pay to change transport systems. So unless money flows, unless the person that flows the money gets some reciprocal benefit, you're not going to have the scale of the flows of capital that you need to pay for all of the stuff.
It's kind of tinkering around the outside, and all we're doing is just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic.
Exactly.
And if the idea is that you're going to solve this problem, the biggest problem we've ever faced as humanity, right? Somebody's going to have to make money doing it, or we're not going to solve it. That's the dirty little secret, right?
You need a carrot as well as a stick, right?
Yeah. And I think it's like our efforts at communicating that as an industry are really poor because we get thought of as this, this elite group that's trying that is all about making money, when they don't realize that most of us in it are there because we're passionate about getting the problem solved. And this is just a tool to get us there.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a really powerful kind of point. And obviously, I want to use that as the kind of the final jumping off point, right? You guys have both kind of been very generous with your time and giving me, and hopefully the audience, some sort of insights in terms of your journeys, right? And given this kind of broader context around the importance and the kind of like the call to action, right? Let's look at, I'm buoyed every day by the youth, right? Ultimately, folks that are young. My team's comprised of 20-year-olds, right? And I thrive off their energy. They have a chip on their shoulder, something to prove. But what's your advice to that generation? I mean, you've got a large team now, Al, and in that team, every time I meet your team, I'm just impacted by how young and dynamic and motivated they are. So what's your advice to them in terms of this, how they navigate their careers, and ultimately fast forward 10, 15, 20 years from now? So open-ended question. I mean, but I don't know, just let's riff.
It's a really good question. I think the market is nascent. It's in the process of formation in this phase, right? So that obviously we'd never demean the work that's happened in the past. We never throw rocks at that because that's the foundation. Yeah. Right? But there's uncertainty, and we've talked about all this like a convergence of different markets, all these different new instruments that are coming out, new different activities. So like the thing that we try to get our team to do, and like you say, they're a pretty impressive bunch. I have 150, and they do tend to like a young end of the spectrum. The tip is basically just like, if you think something should be a certain way and you have evidence and you're probably right. You don't need to, you should sanity check, but you shouldn't like ask for some kind of there's no
hierarchy of approvals to just standard operating procedure overload.
I mean, like just maybe to the anecdotes, we went to Glasgow and we were speaking to, the biggest asset managers in the world and the governments, and we're like, how's the mechanism of this going to happen? How are you measuring this? And the answer was like, we don't know how we're going to measure it. We don't have the data, and we don't know what the mechanism is going to be. So it's like, okay, team, go wild.
Go figure it out.
If you propose something sensible and somebody will use it, and you've engaged with the stakeholders, and there's no adverse consequences, go and do that thing. And because if you have a tight hierarchy, you'll just bottleneck those people, and they won't achieve their potential, and we won't achieve the outcomes that we want. So it's kind of like, just take the baton and run with it is the kind of advice.
I like that.
If something goes wrong, then that comes through pretty quick. And we have so many like external ways to get advice and test what we're doing.
But don't be afraid to fail, essentially. We're building a plane whilst we're flying it, and don't be afraid to fail.
100%, yeah. So
I like that.
Speed is of the essence. And if you get competent people that are thoughtful and engaged, then they
give them runway.
They generally do the right thing, yeah.
Right. Does that echo with you?
That totally echoes, and I think only thing I would sort of build on it is that I think when I talk to young people right now, it's a lot different than the last decade when we were kind of like wandering around the desert. It was
galvanized. It's kind of like they've engaged in this Marshall Plan of decarbonization.
And those years after, like in the formation of Paris and the immediate aftermath, there weren't jobs in this space.
And now,
I think there is like huge opportunity, and frankly, we're suffering from that period when we weren't training people.
Yeah, because now there's a lack of talent. Yeah. Exactly, all this ultra competition.
Yeah, so I say there's amazing opportunity in it, and it's a great time to get in, and that there's so many creative roles you can play, whether you're a technologist or whether you're a finance person, whether you're an expert in communications, whatever it might be, it's like, this is the time, and keep your eye on the ball. That's the other thing, is like, you better have a thick skin, because, you know, people in carbon markets and in the climate space in general, they'll kill their young, eat their young, but stay at it. You know, there's great opportunity, and it's going to take an army to solve this. So I think it's a great career opportunity.
And on that note, I want to thank you guys for sharing that wisdom and sharing your experiences and talking about this subject matter that I hold close and dear to my heart. But thank you so much for the work you guys are doing, and really keen to see where things go from here on out. So thanks for the time, guys.
Thanks, Renee.
Appreciate it.
That's
Cheers.
cool. Cheers. Yeah. Cheers.